There's a stone which is about David Ure, who was a 18th century polymath really. He was one of the first people to document fossils in the Glasgow area, and then he went on to influence all sorts of geologists with his drawings. And he lived in Rutherglen, or worked in Rutherglen for a while. And this inscription that says David Ure, he sits secure, is what his tutor at Glasgow University used to say of him. And then round the sides of the stone there's a series of carvings of fossil plants and organisms which he actually found in the sandstone, the same type of sandstone that this stone is carved from. And then on top there's this kind of abstract, well, it looks abstract carving, but it's almost like a settlement of a series of round enclosures with a perimeter wall, and then this kind of central feature in the middle. And then there's a few carvings of fish on the far side of the stone, referencing the salmon that the Clyde used to be absolutely full of. So the Cuningar Loop is an area of land between Dalmarnock, east of Glasgow, and north of Rutherglen. It's actually in South Lanarkshire, with the Clyde being the border between Glasgow and South Lanarkshire. And it's the biggest meander on the Clyde, if you look on a map. And the inside of that bend is called the Cuningar Loop. It's had an interesting history. It used to be associated with the royal borough of Rutherglen and the castle at Rutherglen back in the 13th century. And then there was a castle nearby at Farm Cross called Farm Castle, and this was part of this was the land associated with that. And then since then it was used as farmland. The name Cuningar actually comes from a word meaning where rabbits used to live, or where rabbits were bred. The word cunny or coney was the old word for a rabbit. And if you look at the Cuningar Loop from above, it actually looks like the outline of a rabbit. It's been a landfill site in the early part of the 20th century, and then more recently it's just been left wild. So for the last 50 years or so, nature has reclaimed it. You can still see evidence of that history. So the place is full of artefacts, and then more recently the rubble from the clearance of the Gorbals. A lot of that was dumped here. So you've got thousands of tons of sandstone just under the ground and on the surface of the ground. And the project which I was involved in a couple of years ago was initially part of a residency associated with exploring the history of the loop and the kind of social history, the natural history of it, and then getting to grips with how it was being transformed by the Forestry Commission and turned into a woodland park. And that's a process that's taken a couple of years and is just being finished off now. There's also a footbridge going in from the Rutherglen side to the Dalmarnock side. I spent time exploring the site, collecting artefacts associated with that mass of landfill material. And although those objects weren't really valuable, they kind of tell the social history of a place that's been quite cut off from communities locally. There's not a lot of awareness, or there wasn't up until a few years ago, that this place even existed. And so getting to grips with that and then understanding the kind of history through a lot of archival research led me to develop a project called the Cuningar Stones, which uses the material from the landfill, so 15 large sandstone blocks, which are then carved over the period of about a year to pick up on some of those stories and those histories, and also kind of to invent a bit of a mythology. So some of it is based on the kind of historical record, some of it is more anecdotal research from speaking with people who have memories of the site and the kind of industrial uses of nearby, and then some of it is just kind of my own interpretation of this landscape. And the 15 stones now sit across the park, kind of reflecting some of those stories. It was important for me to feel like the stones kind of carried their histories, or that kind of evidenced their histories as objects themselves. So the carvings which I did were just on the surface, they weren't kind of obliterating those marks left from before. So you've got the marks of when they were quarried as stones initially, and then the kind of architectural carvings, and then on top of that you've got the scars of the demolition, the being in the ground for 50 years, being re-excavated, and then finally my own carvings kind of intervening in those layers. And the idea is for them not to be so much like monumental pieces of public art. This is something that kind of sits within the landscape, and so I always imagine it in 10, 20, 50 years time, when the stones themselves feel very much of the ground again. And you come across them and you try and unpick some of the stories there, and where that leads you to in terms of engaging with the history of a space, and it's kind of multiple uses is what I'm interested in. And I'm not being too precious about the stones, so they're going to get chipped, they're going to get weathered and damaged probably, and that's okay. Those layers will just build up as the stones continue their life as part of the site, as part of that almost like an archive. And I see the site very much in terms of being this archive of social history and natural history. You might not be aware of the kind of process of transformation that it's gone through, and so the stones in a way articulate some of those links and provide a surface through which some of those those narratives can be explored. There's areas where the the trees have grown quite thick, like these are hawthorn and blackthorn, and then other areas where there's kind of more open grassland, and that's why the deer are so keen to be down here. And in summer there's a huge amount of insect life here, so there's a lot of butterflies, bees, wasps. There used to be a coal mine here, a bit further down, called the Old Farm Colliery. Probably mine workings underneath the ground. I used to be able to get freshwater pearls from the Clyde here as well. You can see these kind of larger expanses of grass where you might see a deer. There's quite a divide now between the part of the Cuningar Loop which has been cleaned up and redeveloped as part of the woodland park, and then the other half which has just been left as it was. But the deer in particular are able to move between both sides, and so you do get this kind of crossover. I mean, this fence to the wildlife doesn't really exist. I'm imagining how this park's going to look in 10, 20, 30 years when all the plastic tree guards have been taken off and it feels much more wild, a kind of less of a managed space as such. It's interesting to see how that transformation will take place.